Welcome to the Bull Moose Network, where I speak softly and carry a big stick. I'm your host, Brian Charles Vish. If you're ready for sharp takes and brutal honesty, do the thing. Like, subscribe, and let's dive right in. Joe Biden's farewell address wasn't just a swan song. It was a mirror held up to the American people, reflecting not only the dangers of an unchecked oligarchy, but also the failures of the very party he represents. The speech painted a picture of storms on the horizon, storms wrought by the concentration of wealth and power among the elite. Yet one glaring truth overshadowed it all. The Democrats helped build the very machine he was warning against. For decades, Democrats branded themselves as the champions of the working class, the We the People Party. But behind the scenes, as the wealth gap widened and corporations grew ever more powerful, their rhetoric often failed to align with their actions. Biden's address felt more like an epitaph for the party that has spent years sidling up to billionaires and pandering to a donor class more concerned with profit margins than public welfare. He spoke of the dangers of oligarchy, as though he and his party hadn't been complicit in its rise. This isn't to suggest malice. After all, Democrats often act with the best of intentions, or so they claim. But good intentions don't pave roads, they don't create affordable housing or secure livable wages. They don't fix a democracy battered by dark money and corporate greed. Biden warned us of an emerging tech industrial complex, but the reality is that the ground beneath our feet had been tilled and fertilized for decades by politicians on both sides of the aisle. And when the oligarchs came knocking, Democrats didn't just open the door, they set out a welcome mat. Let's not pretend that the party's failures haven't had consequences. Their inaction, their coziness with corporate donors, and their repeated refusal to enact transformative change laid the groundwork for something far worse: the rise of Donald Trump and his brand of charismatic authoritarianism. Biden's address may have sounded the alarm, but it was years late. The oligarchy he decried wasn't a future threat, it's our present reality. A direct result of a system his party failed to dismantle because they were helping craft it. This episode isn't about villainizing Democrats for the sake of clicks or controversy. It's about holding them accountable for their choices. Choices that have left millions of Americans feeling betrayed and voiceless. It's about acknowledging that the fight against oligarchy didn't start with Biden's address. It started years ago, and Democrats, for all their talk of progress, often chose compromise over courage. Biden spoke of American possibilities. A possibility without action is a ghost, a whisper of what could have been. If Democrats want to reclaim their mantle as the party of the people, they need to start by confronting their own complacency in creating the very system they claim to oppose. This isn't just a reckoning, it's a reminder that true leadership means more than riz. It means action. And action has been in short supply for far too long. Joe Biden sat behind the resolute desk, delivering his final address with the gravitas of a man who knows the weight of history, but seems reluctant to acknowledge his place in it. The words that flowed from his mouth were laced with regret, a eulogy for a democracy teetering on the brink, hollowed out by wealth, manipulated by the powerful, and ignored by those who once swore to defend it. An oligarchy is taking shape in America, he declared, painting a picture of an unstoppable tide of money and influence, drowning out the voices of everyday Americans. But the real tragedy? This wasn't a revelation, it was a confession. For years, Democrats, Biden included, have enabled the very forces he warned against. Their reluctance to challenge corporate interests head on, their willingness to compromise principles for campaign cash, and their addiction to the status quo that it rewards the rich and punishes the poor. These are the quiet betrayals that led us here. Biden's address could have been a rallying cry, but instead it felt like an overdue admission that the party of the people had long since swapped their work boots for Gucci loafers. Throughout his speech, Biden invoked grand imagery. The Statue of Liberty swaying but never falling, the resilience of the American spirit, the shining promise of a fair shot. But what good is poetic rhetoric when the reality is far grimmer? The working class doesn't need metaphors. We need relief. We need the jobs Biden promised wouldn't be shipped overseas, the healthcare that wouldn't bankrupt us, and the fair wages that would actually reflect the value of our labor. We needed a party that fought for us, not just in speeches, but in policy. And that's where the Democrats failed, spectacularly. Biden claimed his administration had created nearly 17 million new jobs, a statement that conveniently glosses over the reality that many of those jobs don't pay wages that can keep up with inflation. He touted infrastructure improvements, broadband expansion, and semiconductor manufacturing. Yet the same corporations benefiting from these initiatives are the ones funneling billions into the pockets of executives and shareholders while squeezing the workers dry. His words about fairness and dignity rang hollow against the backdrop of his party's consistent failure to rein in corporate excess. And then came his warning about the tech industrial complex, an eerily familiar phrase borrowed from Eisenhower's caution about the military industrial complex. Biden expressed concerns about the concentration of technological power in the hands of a few, about misinformation and AI's potential to reshape society in ways we can't yet predict. But where was this urgency when his party had the chance to regulate big tech? Where was the crackdown when corporations like Amazon and Google crushed union efforts and devoured competitors with impunity? Instead, Democratic leadership, eager for Silicon Valley's donations, sat on their thumbs and smiled through campaign fundraisers. Biden's farewell address was not just an indictment of the dangers posed by oligarchies. It was an inadvertent indictment of his own party's spinelessness. We need to get dark money out of politics, he proclaimed, as though he hadn't watched his own party rake in millions from undisclosed sources in past elections. Super PACs, lobbying firms, and billionaire-backed think tanks have had their fingers in the Democratic pie for decades, crafting policies that serve their interests while leaving working Americans with scraps. Perhaps the most biting moment of Biden's address was his call to make the wealthy play by the same rules as everyone else. A noble sentiment, but one that begs the question: who's been enforcing those rules, Joe? The tax loopholes remain wide open, corporate tax rates remain laughably low, Wall Street continues to operate with impunity while the working class gets lectured about fiscal responsibility. Democrats have had ample opportunity to rewrite the rules, to level the playing field, yet time And time again, they've hesitated, compromised, or simply turned a blind eye. You can't say you had no control, Joe. And let's not forget Biden's parting shot. We must ensure no president is above the law. A thinly veiled jab at Trump, but an ironic statement from a man whose party has failed to hold the GOP or its own accountable. You could have pushed for a prosecution, Joe, but did you? When Democrats had the chance to push for meaningful reforms, whether it was reining in the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, cracking down on corporate lobbying, or enforcing stricter ethics rules, they balked. Instead, they handed out committee seats to millionaires, turned a blind eye to insider trading, and continued to play the game as it was, not as it should be. The speech might have served as Biden's last act of public service, but it was too little, too late. His warnings about rising inequality and the erosion of democratic norms were spot on, but they came from a man and a party that have too often failed to act when it mattered most. The Democrats, once the supposed vanguard of progressivism, have instead become enablers of the very system they claim to fight. Their failure to address systemic corruption and economic inequality has created fertile ground for right-wing faux populists like Trump to thrive. In the end, Biden's farewell was a missed opportunity. An opportunity to name names, to admit fault, and to call for real, tangible change, rather than another round of lofty platitudes. Instead, it served as a bookend to a presidency that, while not without its achievements, ultimately fell short of delivering the structural change America desperately needs. If Democrats want to avoid the same fate in the future, they have to do more than just warn against oligarchy. Aristotle did that, and he did a better job of it. Democrats must actively dismantle it. They must break their addiction to corporate money, embrace bold policies that put workers first, and most importantly, prove through action, not words, that they are still the party of the people. Otherwise, Biden's farewell address will be remembered not as a rallying cry, but as an elegy for a party that lost its way. If Biden's farewell address was an admission of failure, then Democratic leadership, past and present, should be front and center in the list of culprits. For all their talk about fighting for the middle class, their track records read like a love letter to corporate America. Over the years, Democratic leaders have perfected the art of walking the tightrope, publicly decrying the influence of wealth while privately blowing the donor class. They cry foul about economic inequality and then host fundraisers in the Hamptons. They condemn Wall Street's excess while ensuring regulatory agencies stay toothless. It's an act so well rehearsed, you almost have to admire the audacity. Biden's farewell speech hit on the dangers of unchecked corporate influence, but let's be honest. He's been swimming in those waters for decades. He spoke of powerful forces looking to erode democracy. Yet the real force at work has been in his own party's insatiable thirst for campaign cash. Who's been leading that charge? The top brass. Names that have been fixtures in Washington for years, propped up by the very oligarchs Biden warned about. Take congressional leadership, for example. For years, the Democratic establishment has been personified by figures like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, two political juggernauts whose grip on power is only rivaled by their fundraising prowess. Pelosi, with her decades-long career, amassed a donor list that reads like a who's who of Silicon Valley and Wall Street elites. She talked a big game about progressive values, yet under her leadership, the party failed to deliver even the most basic economic reforms for the working class. Corporate tax rates remain laughably low. Healthcare continued to be a privilege rather than a right. And financial regulations were weakened at every turn. Her infamous defense of trading loopholes for Congress, brushing off stock trading by lawmakers as part of the free market, was a perfect encapsulation of the Democrats' cognitive dissonance when it comes to money and politics. Then there's Chuck Schumer, the Senate's supposed bulldog, whose bark has rarely matched his bite. Schumer, a New Yorker through and through, has long been Wall Street's favorite son in Washington. His campaign coffers have been generously stuffed by hedge funds, banks, and real estate developers. And he's been more than willing to return the favor. While Biden warned in his address about the influence of the ultra-wealthy, Schumer has been a key player in ensuring they stay firmly in the driver's seat. Whether it's watering down financial regulations or looking the other way on tax loopholes, his tenure in leadership has been a masterclass in maintaining the status quo while putting on a progressive face for the cameras. And while we're pointing fingers, let's not forget the state-level Democrats, who often follow the same blueprint. In Michigan, for instance, you have figures like Mike Duggan and Curtis Hurdle Jr., who both have cozied up to corporate interests while claiming to fight for the working class Michiganders. Duggan, Detroit's mayor, has spent years championing the revitalization projects that seem to benefit developers and investors more than the struggling communities he claims to represent. Under his leadership, gentrification has surged, while public services for the city's poorest residents remain underfunded and neglected. Meanwhile, Hurdle's political maneuvering has raised more than a few eyebrows. His transition from state senator to a cushy position at Greater Flint Health Coalition, secured with public funds, is a textbook example of the revolving door between politics and private sector profiteering. Even Governor Gretchen Whitmer, once hailed as a beacon of progressive leadership, has found herself walking the well-worn path of courting the rich while leaving the working class on the back burner. Biden's speech warned about the power of the tech industrial complex. Yet Whitmer has been more than willing to welcome corporate giants with open arms, offering tax breaks and incentives while labor rights stagnate. Her administration's alliances with business interests have raised questions about whether the state's economic policies truly prioritize the people over the boardrooms. What Biden's farewell address conveniently left out is that the Democratic Party isn't just a passive observer in the rise of oligarchy. They've been an active participant. They didn't just inherit this system. They helped Republicans build it, brick by brick, donor by donor. From national powerhouses to state-level operators, their fingerprints are all over the economic policies that have left millions of Americans disillusioned and struggling. The party's leadership speaks for fighting for the people, for democracy, but their actions paint a different picture. Dark money, super PACs, and corporate lobbying have become so ingrained in democratic politics that it's hard to distinguish where the party ends and the donor class begins. Biden's call to ban members of Congress from stock trading was met with predictable applause. But let's not forget that his party has had years to push for such reforms and has consistently fallen short. Why? Because change isn't profitable. Now for the GOP. The Republican Party loves to wrap itself in the flag, thump the Bible, and tell you they're the party of the working man. But here's the thing, they're not, and they haven't been for a long time. We're not talking about a recent betrayal either. This isn't some last few decades thing. No, the GOP has been screwing over the American worker since the progressive era, since before most of us were even a twinkle in our grandparents' eyes. Let's take a little stroll down memory lane, shall we? It's 1912, back in the days of Teddy Roosevelt, when men were men and corporate executives feared an ass kicking. Roosevelt saw where things were headed. The robber barons were taking over. Workers were being treated like disposable cogs, and his own party was letting it happen. So what did Teddy do? He walked. He saw the rot setting in and bolted, creating the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, because he refused to be part of a system that kissed the boots of the wealthy while stomping on the working class. The GOP, on the other hand, they stayed right where they were, cozying up to big business and rolling out the red carpet for the elite. That was the moment they chose profit over people, and they've never looked back. Fast forward a few decades, and you've got the Great Depression, a little economic apocalypse brought to you by GOP policies that let Wall Street gamble with the entire economy. Huh, that sounds like a parallel to crypto to me. I'm sure that's just a coincidence, though. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, Teddy's cousin, and arguably the first democratic socialist to actually wield power in this country. The New Deal? It was a direct response to Republican incompetence, a lifeline thrown to the drowning nation. Social Security, union protections, public works. FDR put the government to work for the people while the GOP stood on the sidelines screaming about socialism and big government. Their message? You're on your own, kid. And it's been that way ever since. Fast forward now to the Trump era, and you see the same playbook running on steroids. Trump strutted onto the scene promising to be a champion of the forgotten worker, talking tough about bringing back jobs and sticking it to the elites. What did he actually do? Gave the richest Americans a tax cut so big they're still laughing all the way to the bank. Slashed labor protections, waged war on unions, and let's not forget his mass deportations. And it's only been a fucking week. Farms, construction sites, factories, all left reeling because Trump's big idea of helping American workers was ripping their colleagues out of their communities and throwing them out of the country. And yet, through it all, the GOP still manages to sell this fantasy of being the party of hardworking Americans. They shake hands and stand on factory floors while quietly signing bills that make it easier for corporations to exploit those very same workers. They talk about bootstraps while cutting the strings that hold people up. They've perfected the art of telling you they're fighting for you while they're actually picking your pocket and handing your future to their billionaire buddies. So here's the cold hard truth. The GOP abandoned the working class over a century ago. They didn't stumble into it, they made a choice to align themselves with big business and champion tax cuts for the wealthy, to oppose labor rights at every turn. And now they're so deep in the pockets of corporations, they can't even remember what a real working man's struggle looks like. Take that soft bitch Jesse Waters, for instance, who's so insecure about his masculinity, he can't even eat soup in public. And that weakling, that's the type of person the GOP serves. This isn't just a political party, it's a machine built to keep you down, smile into your face while stabbing you in the back. And it's been doing it for over 100 years. Let's get one thing straight. There's no excuses either. No, we were duped. No, he spoke to us. The grift was obvious from day one. Donald Trump didn't whisper sweet nothings to the American worker. He screamed his con into a gold plated megaphone. And the crowd ate it up like it was the gospel. The man was a walking, talking, bloated caricature of greed. And anyone who thought he'd ride in and save the working class deserves every ounce of the economic kick in the teeth they get. Trump's big pitch, I'm bringing jobs back. What actually happened last time? He handed out corporations the biggest tax giveaway in modern history with his 2017 tax cuts, slashing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, a move that lined the pockets of the same billionaires who already owned half the country. Meanwhile, working class Americans got scraps, tiny temporary tax cuts that vanished as quickly as they appeared, like a magician's cheap trick. And what did those corporate tax breaks do? Did they fuel some great American manufacturing renaissance? Nope. Companies like GM and Harley Davidson pocketed their cash and shipped jobs overseas anyway. But hey, he fought for the American worker, right? Wrong. He didn't just fail workers, he actively screwed us. Look at his labor policies. From gutting OSHA workplace safety regulations to stacking the National Labor Relations Board with corporate lapdogs. Trump waged war on labor in broad daylight. Unions, he treated them like an enemy of the state. Striking workers, he ignored them unless they were good for a photo op. And all those executive orders he loved to sign on camera, not a single one aimed at improving wages, healthcare, or job security for the people who actually needed it. Then there's the coal miners, those poor, desperate souls who clung to Trump's promises like a lifeline. We're bringing coal back, he said, and they believed him. Spoiler alert, coal didn't come back. It never was coming back. The industry continued its slow, painful death, and instead of investing in retraining programs or renewable energy jobs, Trump fed miners a fantasy while their paychecks evaporated. And let's not forget the health care he tried to strip away from the same workers, fighting tooth and nail to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, a move that would have left millions uninsured and financially ruined. Because nothing screams working class hero like telling people to go bankrupt when they get sick. His infrastructure promises were another joke. Remember Infrastructure Week? Of course not, because it never happened. Roads and bridges continued to crumble while Trump focused on cutting regulations for his golf courses and letting corporate polluters run wild. The only thing he built was a monument to his own ego, and even that came in the form of a border wall that contractors were happy to overcharge the government for and never complete. A perfect metaphor for that lump of goo. Let's not forget his crusade against the minimum wage. While Trump and his cronies talked about boosting the economy, they fought every effort to raise the federal minimum wage above the abysmal $7.25 an hour it currently is at. In their twisted reality, a billionaire living off inherited wealth thought it was too much to pay a living wage. Meanwhile, wages stagnated, rent skyrocketed, and the working class fell further behind. But sure, let's pretend the guy who stiffed his own contractors was going to lift the American worker out of poverty. And for all his whining about the forgotten man, Trump's administration did nothing to help small businesses or working families stay afloat. When COVID hit, the Paycheck Protection Program became yet another slush fund for the rich, with massive corporations grabbing millions while mom and pop shops shut their doors forever. Meanwhile, Trump was too busy ranting about stock market numbers to care about the bodies piling up in hospital morgues. Workers were sacrificed to keep the economy going, forced to risk their lives in unsafe workplaces while Trump downplayed the pandemic like it was just another bad press cycle. And still through it all, he managed to convince a chunk of Americans that he was fighting for them. That's the most galling part of it all. He didn't have to hide it. He didn't sneak around screwing people over. He did it in plain sight with a gold tie and a thumbs up. But it didn't matter because the GOP has been running the same scam for over a century, and Trump was just their latest and loudest pitchman. Here's the truth. Trump didn't fail the working class. The working class failed itself by believing this bullshit. The signs were there from the beginning, the flashing neon lights. And now the damage is done. The economy isn't built for workers, it's built for CEOs, stockholders, and political cronies. And Trump? He's back in the White House, stuffing his face with Big Macs and planning his next con like he's going to do another rip crypto rug pull. So yeah, let's cut the sympathy act. No one was duped. They bought the lie because they wanted to. And now we're all paying the price. So here we are, staring down at the ruins of a nation that's been gutted and sold off piece by piece, left with nothing but empty slogans and broken promises. The Democrats, with their slick speeches and hollow rhetoric, stood by and watched the oligarchy rise. Hell, they helped build it. They kissed the rings of the billionaire class and took the checks and convinced themselves that compromise was just another word for progress. Meanwhile, the GOP spent the last century proving one thing. They were never the party of the people, and they never intended to be. They're the party of wealth, of exploitation, of selling out the working man while draping themselves in the flag and shouting about freedom. And what do we have to show for it? An economy that works for the few, a government that bends over backwards for corporations, and a political system that's so rotten. The best they can offer us is a revolving door of the same old faces spouting the same old lies. The Democrats promised change, but instead they gave us Wall Street-approved centrism, a corporate-friendly pat on the head, and a shrug when things got tough. The GOP, they didn't even pretend to care. They just shoved the knife in deeper and told us to work harder. Trump was never the solution. He was the logical end result. A walking, talking middle finger to the system, except the joke was on all of us, because behind the bravado and the red hats, he was just another grifter running the same old Republican con. Cut taxes for the rich, deregulate everything, and cut and gut labor protections while blaming immigrants and the radical left for the fallout. He didn't drain the swamp. He built a luxury hotel there and charged working people for the privilege of drowning it. So let's be clear. This isn't about Trump. This is about a system that's been rigged from the start. The Democrats let it happen, the Republicans perfected it, and the working class, we got left behind, stuck in an endless cycle of being told to work and vote harder while our wages stagnated, our healthcare disappeared, and our futures evaporated. So where do we go from here? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The easy answer is to hope that somehow someone in Washington will wake up and decide to actually fight for the people. But let's not kid ourselves. Hope isn't a luxury we can afford anymore. Real change doesn't come from waiting. It doesn't come from slogans or speeches or election year promises. It comes from pressure, from holding every politician accountable, red or blue, until they remember who they work for. It comes from organizing, from demanding more, and from refusing to accept the scraps they throw our way. Because the truth is, they're going to keep selling us out until we make it impossible for them to do so. The oligarchy isn't some looming threat. It's not on the horizon. It's here. And unless we're willing to stand up, call it what it is, and tear it down brick by fucking brick, we are just another mark in the long con. So stay angry, stay loud, and remember, nobody's coming to save us. We either fight or we get buried. And I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. If this hit a nerve, good. Now do something about it. Like, comment, subscribe, hell, share it with someone who still thinks voting blue no matter who is the answer. Send it to your MAGA sibling who thinks Trump is some messianic figure rather than a golden calf. Get loud, stay engaged, and don't let them lull you back to sleep. Eyes open, voices loud.